Good evening and welcome to the July 26, 2023 East Lansing Planning Commission meeting. Mr. Dempsey, would you please take the roll?
Yeah. Chairperson Sullivan.
Here.
Vice Chairperson Bowman.
Here.
Commissioner Boyd.
Here.
Commissioner Denault.
Here.
Commissioner Hendricks. Commissioner Lapine.
Here.
Commissioner Wagner.
Here.
Commissioner Williams.
Here.
We have 7 present. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for tonight?
So moved.
Moved by Vice Chair Bowman, seconded by Denault. Seeing no discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from the June 28th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting?
Motion to approve the minutes from June 28th, 2023.
Moved by Commissioner Boyd,
Second.
seconded by Commissioner Wagner. Any discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And the motion carries. Are there any committee reports? I do not believe so. So on to item number 3, staff reports. Mr. Dempsey?
Yeah, just one. So we did have an interview earlier this week with a prospective candidate for the Planning and Zoning Administrator position. So it was, I think, a positive interview. We're hoping to bring that individual back next week for some additional meetings with staff. So I have some optimism that potentially this could be a candidate that we could secure for the role. So we'll see how it goes.
Thank you for the update. On to item number 4, commissioner announcements. Are there any announcements? All right, seeing none. On to item 5, communications from citizens. Item 5.1, written communications. I don't believe there was any in the packet.
None received this
okay.
for this meeting.
Noted. Item 5.2, verbal from audience. Is there any members of the audience that wish to come forward and address the commission? If you are here for item 6.1, I suggest you wait for that item. However, any other item on the agenda or off the agenda, you're welcome to discuss. All right. Seeing none, is there anyone on the queue online?
We have nobody waiting in the queue.
All right, that brings us to item number 6, public hearings. Item 6.1, consideration of a request from E&G Connection LLC for a modified site plan and special use permit approval for 115 Albert Avenue. Mr. Dempsey?
Yes, thank you. So before you this evening is a modified site plan and special use permit application for what is currently the Black Cat Bistro at 115 Albert Avenue. They are seeking to change that to Los Tres Mex Grill and would include a number of changes to the facility. One would actually be a reduction in occupancy. So right now, they're currently approved for 110 occupants. This would reduce it to 67 occupants, including 51 seats for patrons on the interior. They are also looking to continue to utilize the outdoor dining area that's on the west side of the property. That is actually currently part of Bill Sharp Park. There's a license agreement that we have in place with the current operators that we would look to amend so that they could continue to utilize that. And then they're proposing to add an additional 6 outdoor dining seats on Albert Avenue. So that would be a new addition to outdoor dining. They're also proposing a number of facade changes as indicated in the plans with sort of a different style that would be more in keeping with the proposed new restaurant, as well as adding roll-up doors on the front, so sort of opening up that building a little bit more to the streetscape. That had initially been discussed for this property back in 2012 with the prior approval. At the time, I think there was some hesitancy, but since then we've had a number of restaurants add that feature, particularly along Albert Avenue. And I think as everyone has seen how that's played out, it's certainly been something that's activated the streetscape, particularly with the addition of Albert al fresco as well. Other than that, they do propose some differences with operating hours. Those would be 11 a.m. In the morning till 2 a.m. right, the following sort of day. So that does extend operating hours for the business. Other than that, those are really the key changes. As I indicated, the floor plan as well as the exterior renderings are included within the application packet. They also provided a little bit more narrative around the operation as well as a proposed menu for the facility. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions. The applicant and their team are here as well to answer any of your questions and provide more background if needed.
Any questions from commissioners?
Just have one question,
Oh,
just to
Commissioner
just to
Boyd?
clarify the hours of operation. In the staff report, it says that they're going to be open from 11 to 2 Monday through Friday, but in their application, it says 11 to 2, 7 days a week.
Yeah, and I believe it would be the 7 days a week. I think the Monday through Friday should have been probably Monday through Sunday. So,
Okay.
Yep.
Just,
Vice Chair?
it seems that the outdoor dining seems to become a kind of an important part of the current setup. There will be
Yeah, what
application.
Yeah, what we would do is we would present a revised license agreement. So they currently have a license agreement with the city that specifies how they can utilize the space, who maintains it. That license agreement would need to be amended, and that would be done by city council. So to continue to operate that would necessitate that.
So that's tied to the establishment, not to the building.
Yeah, right, yes, there was an expectation at that time and makes their recommendation to city council that we would pair that agreement and any revisions at that time to council.
Great. I had a couple questions, actually. So on the Albert Avenue sidewalk there, it's pretty tight. How much space does that leave for pedestrians? How many feet?
Yeah, I believe, let's see here. You are correct, it does narrow there. I think that's our 12-foot.
Okay. What page is that on?
Sorry, this is on sheet SUP 1.1.
Yep. Yeah, so there's a 8-foot clearance from curb to where their proposed railing would be. So they have a 4-foot area sort of designated for their seating area,
Okay.
plus an additional little butt.
And then the two other questions I have might be for you, might be for the applicant, so I'll just ask them now. So as for the capacity reduction, what's primarily the reason for that is the first question, and then the second question is this proposal exclusive to just that one side of the building and not the other side? Because from the renderings, it looks like they're proposing to remodel the entire exterior.
Yeah, I can answer the exterior one. So they do plan to update the facade along the entire front, so that will impact the space to the east. However, they're not occupying that space. There's a current tenant in there that will continue to operate. As far as sort of the change in the seating, I'll let the applicant get into the specifics of that, but it's essentially due to the change in the style and how they're going to be serving their patrons. So, but I'll let them explain that in more detail.
Great, thank you. I think we're ready for you.
Find out. And how we got to the occupant load is just based on our new floor plan layout. We put a vestibule on the inside that ate up some space, so we could keep the cold out or the hot out, depending on the season. And we have a line in front where people will come up and get their food. So that also took away from our seating capacity. And so all these numbers are generated by the building code as to how, we arrived at 67.
So I see you have a limited menu there compared to a typical Los Tres Amigos restaurant. Is this, is there no servers? You just walk up to the counter and order? What is the style of the restaurant?
We're going to let Dan, the general manager, speak on that.
Yeah.
Hi, Dan Tyler. We are going to have some service, but it's limited service. What we're trying to do is fast casual, but those who want to sit on our patio, we do want to be able to take care of them at the same time. That's pretty much it.
So then how does the alcohol portion work? Is it, self-service alcohol? Like,
No,
how does
no,
that
no,
work?
So we will, just like we'll have people behind the line serving food, there'll be a bartender back there with margaritas. And then if you place your order within the facility, you can then go to the bar, grab a drink, have a drink while you're sitting and waiting for your food, or have a drink while you're sitting and waiting for your food to be delivered to your table.
So it almost seems like some breweries I've been to where you order your alcohol separate and then you have your
You
food
got
separate.
it.
Got it.
You got it.
That makes sense. Any other questions? Mr.
I
Wagner?
have a question, but it's about outdoor seating. So I'm not sure who I should
Go ahead.
ask. But I'm looking on Google and I see there's a fire hydrant next to the door. Have you incorporated that into your
Yes.
design?
That was, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
So that's actually a PIV valve, and they can control the water to the building with that valve, make sure it's on if the firefighters come. So we kept the railing just back of that. That's gonna be outside, so they can
Oh,
still
okay.
access it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I see it's a one-story building and there's kind of an artificial second story cap added on. What's that going to be used for? Is there anything that's going to be up there or is it purely aesthetic?
Purely aesthetic.
Okay.
Yeah, actually,
Vice Chair?
I think you've done a masterful job of, I think you called it the muted Spanish style, and I think you've captured that. To my way of thinking, if you wanted to mute it even more, that would be, this is a comment I make only because you're working for a special use permit that's probably outside of our typical purview for the planning commission, and this will not affect my vote one way or the other, but I think you should feel comfortable with dialing it back even further, than you already have. One person's opinion, right? The cupola could come or go. I think it looks attractive, don't get me wrong, but I think if, should be looking to save construction costs from this one person's opinion, I think you could get away without doing that. Just, again, it's really just, I don't know if you've got a whole chain of restaurants throughout the Midwest and they all have a corner cupola, right? Well, you're not getting rid of it now. But again, it's just, I think that the muted Spanish style, I think it's a good way to call it. I think you should feel comfortable with, if you wanted to, dial back a little bit more. Yeah, sure. In fact, actually, this is just, just looking at the elevations, I thought, that looks okay. The rendering really captures it extremely well, absolutely, yeah. So your renderer is to be commended, yeah. Was that you? Okay, well done.
Any other questions?
Yeah, hi. I just wondered if you could provide us a little bit more information about why you chose the location that you did, especially when there are two other Mexican restaurants right on Albert Street that you would maybe be directly or indirectly competing with. So just a little bit more insight.
So Black Hat's been in existence for roughly 11 years, and we think that the concept itself is a great concept, but where we have it is a little offbeat because the patrons that are gonna, it's just the environment in which we're in. So we've got a proven concept with the Los Tres Amigos in the food. We did open a store in Jackson. It was a test store to see if the market would embrace us, and we found that it would. And it was in a very desolate area. We're just trying it. And then with what the other two Mexican places have going on, LS is LS. It's going to be LS forever. Their food is their food. And then I think Barrio is across the street. They have their own niche as well. You guys have visited those establishments. That's a niche. Whereas we have our own, Mexican restaurant or Mexican food can be looked at as the same, but it's completely unique to its individual entity. And Arnulfo Ramirez is the owner of the concept, and he has a unique spin on their food and where it's from and the region it's from in Mexico. So, and it's fast casual where we're not looking to get you drunk. It's just different. Business people, college students, young professionals, I think will attract some of the same, but I think it'll be a diverse clientele for us as well.
comments or questions? Seeing none, at this point, we can open the public hearing. Are there any members of the public that wish to address the commission on this item? Seeing none, anybody in the queue?
We don't have anyone waiting in the queue.
Great. Well, thank you for coming and for the explanation. I believe we will see this at the August 16th meeting. Is that the next date?
It's the August 9th. meeting.
9th meeting. All right. All right. Thank you. That brings us to we're going to close the public hearing, and then we're going to move on to item number 7, old business. Item 7.1, consideration of zoning ordinance revisions for mass timber construction in the B3 district. Mr. Dempsey?
Yes. So at your last meeting, you had presentations from Midwest Strategy Group and representatives from Michigan State University talking about mass timber, both generally the benefits of it, the advantages that can be accrued to, not only the building itself, but the broader sort of environmental impacts. Along with that were proposed zoning ordinance changes that would provide some level of incentives to sort of move this forward. And by incentive, really sort of adjusting the requirements for buildings that would be defined as mass timber and allowing them to be approved under site plan review and exempting them from the special use permit requirements. So what we tried to do here was just briefly lay out what we see as those key changes, adding that definition of mass timber to the ordinance, relying on and referencing back to the International Building Code, allowing mixed-use mass timber buildings as a permitted use, as I mentioned, subject to site plan approval within the B3 district, in really sort of two types, both multifamily with 3 or fewer bedrooms per dwelling unit, but then also containing another use, so a mixed-use building, or primarily an office building that would also have mixed use, one of the other permitted uses within the district. It would, because it would not be subject to the special use permit, in particular, it's important to note that for residential buildings, it would not be subject to the city's 25% requirement for diverse housing. So that is a fairly substantial change. And then the other change would be allowing mass timber buildings up to 160 feet, as again, as a permitted use in the B3 height overlay district, which is going to be Abbott to the west, Albert to the north, Bailey to the east, and then Grand River to the south. Typically, as you all probably know, it's 8 stories, 112 feet is the basic maximum, with up to 140 feet if deemed by council to have some significant public benefit, but potentially up to 160 feet if it's in that overlay district and also meets the public benefit test of 140 feet. So again, it would lessen the SUP sort of review of that process and make it more of a permitted, provided that they meet the other site plan requirements. So in effect, those are sort of the incentive aspect of this, where you're freeing them from some of the requirements that we typically would have. Now, as I mentioned in our prior meeting, typically, so zoning ordinance changes are often generated by a particular issue that might arise where staff bring them forward. In this case, we had an external entity that was interested in advocating for this, so they brought it forward. It's been presented now at the Downtown Development Authority. It's been here at the Planning Commission and then the Commission on the Environment. So at this point, staff is looking for direction from the Planning Commission, primarily because it is ultimately your ordinance, and projects that would potentially come forward to you in the future, should this change be adopted, will of course be reviewed by the Planning Commission and subsequently City Council. However, given that you're the first group that sees these projects, we thought it made sense to have the Planning Commission, suggest sort of a course of action here. And I laid out some possibilities for you. One could be recommending that council sort of introduce it as drafted and then send it through the formal process we do for ordinances, where there'd be a public hearing on it. We'd get formal input and go through your recommendation process and then back to council. We could potentially do that with modifications to the way it's currently written. You could also have a study group convened that could be a subset of the Planning Commission and potentially others that you might want to have participate, maybe representatives from the Commission on the Environment, the DDA, staff who, could bring some additional insights. We have, our building official or others, or simply, not sort of introduce this. One of the things we talked about, or that I mentioned last time, is that for those of you that are newer to the Planning Commission, you may not have sort of seen this, but for those of you who've been around for a while, we know that historically, the City Council has been quite hesitant to change special use requirements. So typically, a lot of what you review at the Planning Commission level is recommended to Council for approval. What you often see in other communities is the Planning Commission can take action oftentimes on site plans, and that also special use permit requirements may not be as extensive or might not apply to as many projects as you have in East Lansing. And that's simply been sort of our local practice, and our city councils over the decades have been comfortable with that process. In fact, that's one of the major sticking points for the city not being able to secure the redevelopment ready communities designation from MEDC, is that we don't have as much of a streamlined process as you see in other communities. Now, you can sort of argue the merits and the challenges to that, but that's where we stand, and I just want to provide that as history. So just giving you that as a reference point here. But with that, I'll pause at this point. Representatives from Midwest Strategy Group and MSU are here again, as well as David Pearson, I believe, who crafted the language. So I'm sure they're happy to provide further background and context if desired, as well as answer any questions. And I'm certainly here to do that the best I can as well.
This is a question for Tim. Did I hear you say the DDA did have an opportunity to review this?
Yes, they did.
Did they
Yeah.
have a reaction or take a position on it?
I think the initial reaction, there wasn't necessarily extensive feedback provided, but generally, I think people like the concept, right? They understand the benefits could be potentially significant. I think there was interest in examining this, so I think from their angle, they're definitely open to sort of exploring what this could mean for downtown. So certainly there wasn't any immediate concerns expressed. But mind you too, that the DDA is coming at it from more of the broader sort of development aspect, not necessarily looking at the nuances of the zoning issue.
Could I have a follow-up?
Please.
Was there conversation specifically about exemption from the diverse housing requirement?
The DDA did not really get into that in a lot of detail. It was mentioned that that was a factor here. I think the diverse housing, the DDA, again, I've been gone almost the last 4 years, so I don't know what discussions have been with the DDA on that topic specifically as of late, but I know prior to my departure, there were certainly DDA members supportive of that concept, but then there are others who maybe thought it was a little too restrictive. So there's not necessarily always a unanimous consent on that issue.
Thanks.
Tim, can I ask a quick question? So I'm looking at the boundaries of this, and it's pretty specific. It's very specific. Can you give me an example of what a project might be? I don't see any, in my mind, that whole area is developed. Would it be tearing down something to put, do you have any ideas, or maybe I should ask?
Well, I'll use a real-world example that you're going to have before you at your next meeting. So 530 Albert Avenue, which is the parking lot behind the Peanut Barrel. The western 2/3 of that are privately owned. The city leases that portion of the lot to operate the larger lot. The city owns the eastern 1/3. So a developer is going to be coming forward with a 5-story residential project, affordable housing. Now, they're not seeking to develop a mass timber building, at least at this stage, but potentially if this was in place, they could take advantage of that use because they're doing a residential project, and they would actually meet the bedroom definitions here, because what they're going to propose, what you'll see are all studio, 1 and 2 bedroom units. So they would fit the definition if they used mass timber as their method of construction. So under that scenario, that particular project could, again, if this ordinance was in place, come forward and have a 160-foot building, that's allowed under the site plan provisions and not subject to the special use permit. Now, interestingly enough, okay, that project is proposed to be all affordable housing, so it'll be 100% under our diverse housing, so to speak. But again, if it was another type, if it was just market rate residential, that would be an example of one area. So in terms of other development opportunities, I think your question is a good one, because you sort of have to look at property by property and say, okay, which properties are unlikely to be redeveloped, right? Like, for instance, the Center City project where Target, right, that was just developed a few years ago, that's not a candidate. But if you look at some of the other maybe 1 or 2 story buildings along Grand River, you have possibilities, a fair amount, I would say, along the Grand River stretch, when you get into the 300, 400, 500, well, not the 300 block as much, portions of it, but the 400 and 500 blocks, and even 600 block of Grand River could all be potential redevelopment sites, so.
So essentially, you're just future-proofing it in case, or down the line when those buildings potentially are redeveloped.
Yeah, again, any of those, right, if this is in place, potentially could take advantage of that if, yeah.
Right. I think there were a couple other questions, Commissioner
Yeah,
Lapine.
my question is just similar to Commissioner Williams. I heard you, I was not at the last meeting, so I'm coming up to speed. But I heard you mention that this is going to go before the environmental group. Has that happened?
Yes.
Was there discussion there? Could you give like a synopsis of the conversation?
Yeah, so I wasn't present at the Commission on the Environment, but again, my understanding is that I think there was interest in the concept, right? I think the environmental benefits that were discussed at the last meeting are fairly substantial. There's a lot of emerging literature on the topic, and I think from that angle, there's definitely, again, interest, because the concept has, the potential, right, to reduce carbon footprints and have other environmental benefits. And that commission, obviously, that aligns, I think, with their priorities and goals, generally speaking.
Okay, thank you.
You probably all discussed this already when I was not here last time either, but I mean, I'm for the concept. I love the STEM building on campus. I've been there several times. It's very cool. I'm from the Northwest. I'm a tree hugger. But I'm a little concerned about the 160 height. I can't imagine, behind the peanut barrel, a 160-foot building. It seems like it'd be out of place. And I don't understand why, do we have to give up special use permits to have this?
I mean,
Comment real quick. The building that's proposed on that site isn't 160 feet. That was, I think, what's 4 stories?
But it
Not, I
could
mean,
be.
that's.
It
well,
could be, if we
Could
were-
be, potentially. So, yeah.
the difference today is, so if somebody proposes 160 feet, there has to be that substantial public benefit, right? You have to sort of see something that's in there that allows it to get to that. I mean, you have to do the same for the 140 feet. When you look at like the Center City project, for instance, I mean, some of the additional height, it came down to, hey, we're going to have a major retailer on the first floor. They're going to provide goods and services that we don't have downtown, primarily a small grocery, right? And that was deemed as one of the key benefits. We have 55-plus housing as part of that project, right? Those types of things. So someone could still come today and propose a building and meet that standard. The difference here is if they have the mass timber and they meet that definition, they don't have to meet those other things. So this doesn't mean that you have to have them to have mass timber. I mean, MSU built it. I guess you'd have to look at the economics, right, and weigh those out. But it is also one of those things to sort of move the market along early. I mean, mass timber is becoming more popular, but it's still not the predominant, not in East Lansing yet, and maybe someday it will be. And I'll defer a lot of that to the experts who know mass timber far better than I do. But at the end of the day, it's all part of the economic equation, right? cost of construction, cost of land acquisition, and then your cash flow. What can you generate in rents? And, at the end, you sort of figure that equation out. And
Yeah.
and that's something that's in flux always, right? The cost of steel can hamper projects at times, just like the cost of wood frame construction can be problematic depending on the market, so.
Welcome.
Hi, good to see you again, Chair Sullivan. Commissioners Lapine, and I'm sorry, I can't see your name because your tag is black. Hi, Commissioner Wagner. I'm Sandra Lupien. I'm the Director of Mass Timber at MSU. Nice to meet you. I didn't see you last time. To answer your question about do we have to have the exemption in order to have mass timber, the answer is no, but the idea is that having the exemption provides an incentive that helps to offset a green premium that's typically associated with building with mass timber in this period kind of early adoption, right? You might typically see that a mass timber materials tend to have a higher price point than alternative materials that you might typically use in a large building, right? So the idea is mass timber has all of these benefits that align with the City of East Lansing's kind of sustainability plans and climate plans and ethos. Wouldn't it be good to have some mass timber in downtown East Lansing, but it might get value engineered out of the process if there's not something to support making that decision? Kind of like, with incentives for early adopters of solar and clean energy, similar concept.
I'll just note for the minutes, too, that Commissioner Hendricks arrived at 7:27. Any other questions or comments?
I've got a comment.
Vice Chair?
So appreciating what Dr. Lapine? No, our previous speaker just mentioned. I'm of two minds regarding this, that in addition to the sort of the cost additions, is that the engineering is still somewhat unusual, and that, we wouldn't, rather than dealing with sort of your typical, what we would see in steel or concrete connections that try to get mass timber, particularly of the height you're talking about, also, introduce an additional premium, particularly in terms of just sort of providing the initial information that would be required for a site plan, right? So like that, in order to give us the proper renderings and give us some idea about what the elevations would look like, we're really looking at some significant upfront costs, and that to balance that, the owner, I think, is looking for some assurance that there's going to be a payoff at the end. This ultimately comes back to the idea that, that we had tried to introduce with the form-based code that's been sidelined now. And I'd look at you, not because it's your fault, but just because I know that that it's sidelined, and in the attempt to try to introduce a lot more early assurance, so that, check these boxes, and the expectation is that approval would have been made. So I'm sympathetic that, this is a good reason to move forward with it. On the other hand, the 2021 International Building Code hasn't been adopted yet. It's, it's still in process, and I wonder why are we rushing? Why, is there any reason why we couldn't wait a little longer? I mean, ultimately, I'm thinking, my personal preference right now is that we ask that a committee of this group be formed and take a little bit further, some more time to think about it. And I know I would like to see our building official as part of that committee if it were so formed. Ultimately, he's the authority having jurisdiction, and he's going to be the one that's going to have to decide whether or not he's comfortable going outside of the parameters that are established by the current 2015 building code that we're working under. So, ultimately, yeah, he absolutely has the authority to make that change or to make decisions that are sort of outside of what would typically be permitted. How comfortable is he in doing that? That we could push it to him. And I don't know, I suppose council could probably tell him to do it, but that strikes me as maybe a step too far.
Well, and certainly I think at this point, he likely wouldn't be comfortable. We've had some conversations about it. I think there's an expectation also, though, that the Michigan Building Code is going to be updated later this year at some point in the fall, and it will have much more detail on mass timber as a result of the IBC code language. So that would potentially change that dynamic. So, but certainly, to hear from him and have him weigh in is of value.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of finish by saying I'm reminded of some of the things that Mr. Pearson had said when we were talking about the form-based code stuff, is why don't we just run this up the flagpole and see what council has to say? I mean, maybe that, if ultimately that could be something that the committee could determine, but why pre-edit a possible, change to the ordinance? Let council make that decision. Talk about it, let's discuss it and let's decide, but and it seems to me that there's a place here for this. We could be early adopters, and I think there's some benefit to that.
Did you want me to respond to your question about
I wasn't really.
why?
I wasn't really.
That wasn't a question?
I was thinking I was speaking fact, but maybe I'm not. My expectation is that people that can do mass timber engineering are not as common as those who might be able to do, say, steel or concrete.
That's true. We don't have as many trained and experienced engineers working in mass timber yet, so that was a good question. My question about your question was, did you want me to speak to why we would suggest moving forward with this before the 2021
sure.
IBC is adopted in Michigan? And to that, I would say the 2021 mass timber elements of the International Building Code have been adopted in more than 13 states across the country right now. They're well established. We're starting to see projects in other jurisdictions in Michigan being approved based on the 2021 International Building Code because there's such rapidly increasing demand for mass timber. So cities and jurisdictions are seeing like we don't want to push this off because we see the benefits here, and so this makes it easier more quickly.
I have two comments, real quick. The first one I already flagged is the definition of mass timber building. I think it's a little unusual that it specifies the 2021 version of the International Building Code instead of just stating the most current version of that code or some other variation of that. I'm just used to looking at state laws, frankly. So that would probably necessitate a revision to the ordinance every time there's an update in the building code. So there might be a more elegant way to phrase that. That's the first comment. But Mr. Pearson wrote that, so he's probably right. So.
I've got another thing to ask him. So.
Oh, okay.
We went around about that.
I think you might get a couple questions.
If I may, we couldn't say the building code of current adoption because it doesn't have mass timber in it.
Right.
Or it does, but frankly, it's a very limited form of it. So I said, let's put in 2021 because it's already likely to be adopted yet this year. And then we would be in a position, I think, to be able to do exactly what you say, which would be of current adoption. And since, as you point out, you don't control it, the state does, that would then go along. So that would be our expectation for the future. But I appreciate your flagging. It is odd to say that. Yeah.
And I think you have a second question from the Vice Chair.
I don't expect you to sort of memorize chapter and verse, but this is under the permitted uses, and we've added multiple family dwelling units with 3 or fewer bedrooms and I thought it was offices. Oh, office or established provided. Then it refers back to as long as it contains one or more of the principal uses permitted in subsection 1 of this section. So those are that's item J and K, but those are also part of item 1, J through all the way A through K. So it's basically referring back to those items that were part of the ordinance already, but then, if I'm not mistaken, it also sort of self-referential. So it's saying, I think it's establishing multiple family dwelling units and offices as a principal use.
So what's intended is that it does, you can do a standalone office building, or you can do a mixed use. So what's intended there is to call out that it can't be solely residential, is what's intended.
Okay.
So you have to have one of the other uses that are permitted in the B3 as a use by right.
Okay, so basically you're saying that the two that are being added can't be standalone, can't be done all on their own, the office and the multifamily.
The office could be because office is also otherwise permitted, if you read it for all it's worth. But yes, one or the other. At some point it becomes circular, you're right. We'll be doing mixed use within mixed use.
That's right.
So yes, but I wasn't sure how else to do that.
Right.
And The form that's used in the special use permit provision for when residential multifamily is permitted in the B3 is it has to be with another use that's permitted in the zone, which are all non-residential uses, unless you get the special use permit that says you can just do residential.
Sure.
So
Thanks. Yep.
we got wound around there. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Dempsey, I have a procedural question. So typically, there's a motion made, and then we discuss that motion. I'm not sure what motion is to be made. Certainly, I second the thought of a committee being formed, as the vice chair had suggested. Are we determining things like the composition of that committee, logistics of the committee, and other variables for it, or
Yeah,
what are we deciding?
You would, if you recommend a committee or study group, you could definitely determine how many members you want from the, of course, starting from the planning commission, and then in addition to others you might want to have as part of that. So that's in your purview if you want to go that route.
So go that route isn't go that route tonight?
If you desire. I mean, again, because this wasn't a public hearing, this was brought forward prior to a formal introduction. It gives you a little bit more leeway in terms of how you want to dispense with it.
Actually,
Vice Chair.
I'm just noticing that you're actually suggesting that council direct the commission to convene a study group? Is that the mechanism then? We would just form a subcommittee of the planning commission?
So the recommendation there was provided in the sense that it would be helpful to have council look at this somewhat early, just because if there's a lot of angst or heartburn over the special use permit changes and they're really not interested, it might behoove those who are advocating for it to know that early on. So if you recommend that that council sort of convene this group and have them direct that, that's fine. You could certainly, again, because it hasn't been a formal introduction, you do have that leeway, as I mentioned earlier, to do it on your own, but it might behoove us to have that. Because the other part of this too is if council is aware that there's interest in the planning commission to pursue it, okay, doesn't mean you're all saying you're supporting it. That's not what you're saying. But if you're interested in pursuing it further, that might send a message to council that says, okay, maybe this is something we should be thinking seriously about, versus just potentially dismissing it. And I'm not trying to predict what they're going to do either. I'm just laying out potential scenarios.
Commissioner Williams?
Commissioner Bowman raised an issue that really resonates with me, and that's probably because of our experience in working on the form-based code over years, I think it was. I think it was years, and now it has been languishing for years. In a perfect world, in my view, an issue like this would be part of that conversation, because this was an issue, not necessarily this topic, but environmentally sensitive material use being part of an exemption opportunity was part of our discussion, part of what went up to council. And I just think it makes some sense for us not to jump on board and do another big study committee and bring together a lot of people without kind of testing out the interest that city council has on the issue. So my preference would be that we just bump it forward and see what they think.
Yeah, is that a motion? Seems kind of
But
like a
let's
motion,
talk about
sort
it.
of. I think that, either that or make a motion for the third bullet that's in the staff report on, is that page 3? Page 2?
So from a procedure perspective, can you just describe to me, I agree with the perspective that Commissioner Williams is sharing. So we hypothetically bump it to council. Does council then send it back to us?
I think
Yeah, I mean, if you send it to council and ask them to introduce it formally, they'll determine whether they want to do that or not, right? They'll either, Or if you send it back to council and say, we'd like to convene a study group to
Right.
do this, but we want sort of council's directive to do so, again, they can decide yay or nay on doing that. I'd be surprised if they wouldn't sort of go along, at least with the study group. Now, introducing of the formal ordinance, that's a little bit different because that is definitely getting to the resolution quicker, which again, they may be comfortable with. I can't speak for them at all.
So we could, at the same time, recommend that we would like to have a, I'm not using the right term, but like a work group of some kind come together and have that also be our recommendation to council. Instead of having them comment in some, take some direction and then bump it back to us, and then us then say we want to have a work group. We could just say, we'd like to have a work group and we want it to go to council. And that would be our recommendation to council. Am I grasping that concept correctly?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you can combine those, right? You could ask
Okay.
them to formally introduce, and knowing that the planning commission will then form a study group, right? It's their
Yeah.
recommendation that you introduce, and then they're going to appoint a study group.
Because I guess I
to do
say,
that,
I say
right?
that because I think I do think something of this nature and magnitude, and I feel like I saw somewhere in the materials that this would be like the first, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first instance of this in Michigan, like East Lansing would be the first city, really. I think we would be remiss not to have some level of work group formed around that. I guess that's my comment. So however we move forward with it makes sense to me, but I think we need to have a deeper dive from others than just the planning commission and city council. But that's just me.
Yeah, I would agree. I would really like our colleagues on the Commission for the Environment to be part of a working group of some sort, so I would lean that way as well.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Williams?
I'd like to make a motion for discussion purposes. I move that the Planning Commission recommend to council the introduction and consideration of the draft zoning ordinance revisions for mass timber construction in the B3 district, and to return the matter to the Planning Commission for the formation of a study group, should that be deemed appropriate by the council.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Boyd. Okay, so discussion. So thank you for the motion. The more I think about this, the more I think we should ultimately, I'm in favor of creating a committee. I think that's the direction to go. I think this is a complicated topic. I think we need some input on this. Ultimately, I think council should be the one determining the composition of that committee, though. I feel a bit uncomfortable with us deciding who from what commission or city staff or whoever should be on that commission. I think that should probably be council creating that, deciding what the timeline and the logistics for that are and what the composition is. I think tonight, potentially, we could discuss who among us would want to serve on such a committee. I think that'd be beneficial. So to clarify, your motion is to recommend that council directs us to create the committee. Is that correct?
My motion was specifically that we bump it up to them for their discussion and consideration. And then if they are supportive of the concept being studied, to return it to us. They can certainly do that with directions about representatives from various constituent groups within the city, which is what I would expect. But that's the purpose of my motion. I really don't want to support the creation of another big study committee without the support of council. I'd like to
Agreed, yeah.
make sure that council is on board with that. And if I would expect that they would give us some direction in the formation of the committee, but that we would probably be the entity that would coordinate that body moving forward. That's the purpose of my motion.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I'm more comfortable with that direction after that explanation. You know, I guess just for a little bit, I want to talk about just the topic of mass timber in general. Personally, I see a lot of benefits to it. I think from a process perspective, environmental, you can see from the coalition that's built, there's potentially a manufacturing benefit to the state, an economic benefit to the state, shipping, logistical benefits. So I think it's a direction that the city should take a long look at and try to be a leader in and on the forefront of. And I'm in favor of getting the ball rolling, and I think ultimately we do need some of that direction from council as to what that looks like. So, I certainly would be in favor of your motion. So, is there any other discussion? Commissioner Denault?
I think I just have maybe a point of clarification. Is there a potential for council not to send this back to us? To simply approve it and just say, sorry, Planning Commission, you won't see this again?
There is that potential. I don't know that it's great potential, given sort of the interest that has been expressed here, at least initially, as well as with the Commission on Environment and the DDA. But there is that possibility.
Okay. I only ask because I think I do have some questions still about mass timber, and I would like the opportunity to be on a committee. Yes, I am volunteering myself. To be on a committee to talk more with our colleagues from other commissions in the city and other constituent groups. I think, and I think for that reason, it makes me, I think, nervous to send it to council, knowing that it has maybe the small potential not to come back to us. So
Ultimately, we don't really recommend anything, or we just recommend things.
No, I
We don't get to
understand.
decide anything. Council ultimately has to.
Just-
Good point, though.
Hopefully to allay some concerns. If council adopts this as an ordinance as written, there's going to be public hearings where you get the opportunity to comment.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah. A
so-
formal introduction and an ordinance number, public hearing here, recommendation by Planning Commission. They would likely want the input, again, of the DDA formally, Commission on the Environment formally, before they would even have their public hearing, so. Yeah, there's still a process to work through.
Any other comments, questions? Commissioner Wagner?
I'm sorry. Cindy, I missed the beginning of your motion. I know it was complicated, so
You're
I
not going to ask me to
apologize.
repeat it.
No, so I'm in favor of,
write it down?
I'm in favor of sending it to council, but I don't want to vote on whether or not to approve it now. So can we send it with no recommendation for approval? Just a note saying we would like them to,
I think that's exactly what we're doing.
think
We're
that's
not
exactly
making a
what the
recommendation on the
okay,
language
it
itself.
wasn't to
We're
approve.
making a
Reduce it as
recommendation.
Okay.
Yeah, to create a committee to look at this issue and make
Okay.
an ultimate recommendation for an ordinance revision.
So we're not approving it tonight?
No.
If we say.
Unless you want to, or you may, is
No,
that a motion?
no.
Any discussion, additional discussion? Seeing none, I believe a vote is in order. Can we do a roll call on this one?
Sure. Bear with me a second here. All right. Okay, Commissioner Williams,
Yes.
Commissioner Wagner,
Yes.
Commissioner Sullivan,
Yes.
Commissioner Lapine,
Yes.
Commissioner Hendricks. Yes. Commissioner Denault,
Yes.
Commissioner Boyd,
Yes.
Commissioner Bowman.
Yes.
All right.
Passes unanimously, 8-0.
Thank you much, and thank you for being here tonight. Appreciate the overview. All right, I believe that brings us on to item number 8, new business. There is none. Number 9, commissioner concerns. Is there any concerns from Commissioner Williams?
Not a concern, just a question to Mr. Dempsey. Is there any update on the Karate's Restaurant and Bocce Ball project?
Yes, I can give that to you. So we actually had a meeting a few weeks ago with their general contractor. They now sort of have a construction schedule set up. As you recall, it's a 2-story building. So we've been working extensively with them about potential short-term alleyway closures, because they're going to have to bring in some steel beams. Don't tell the mass timber people. So they're going to bring some cranes in. Based on their construction schedule, they're getting underway now with some initial demolition and some foundation work. And then those beams should be potentially around the holiday season, end of December, early January, before students return to get some I-beams set for the second story and then sort of move on from there. So they're finally getting rolling with it and getting things moving.
I
So
keep waiting and watching to see what's happening, and nothing's happening, so thank you for that.
yeah, it's taken a little while, but they're finally getting their stuff together and getting the alleyway permits, and they're waiting for MDOT for a short-term lane closure and some other things. So.
I have visited their Howell location a couple of times now, and it's a fun spot.
I'm excited about it too. Any other comments or concerns? I'll just add, thank you for helping us navigate through this tonight. It was a little bit of an unusual agenda item, so appreciate the guidance.
No, and staff appreciates your flexibility. Again, we've not had a request like this come from an external entity, at least in a long time that I can recall. So we've been a little bit fluid here in terms of how we approach it, so we appreciate your flexibility too.
Thank you. All right, is there a motion to adjourn? Moved by Commissioner Boyd, seconded by Williams. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. We're adjourned at 7:59.